Between 1943 and 1946, the United States Army hanged 70 of its own soldiers in Europe. 55 of them were black, in an army that was 8.5% black. Somebody signed the memo that made that possible. His name is on your grandfather's history books. He has a movie made about him. He has 2 ivory-handled revolvers in every photograph. You have heard his name 1,000 times. You have never heard this story. Meuse River Valley, eastern France. Night the 31 of August 1944, a Sherman tank sits dead at the shoulder of a broken road. Its engine ticks as it cools. Around it, silence. The kind of silence that comes only when men out of things to say. The men are Third Army. They have raced across France so fast the maps are still folded. 90 miles to their left, Paris is celebrating a liberation that is barely a week old. 100 miles to their front, the border of Nazi Germany waits behind hedgerows and dragon's teeth. The war, at this moment, feels like it could end by Christmas. But the tank does not move. Beside it stands a 58-year-old man in polished cavalry boots and a helmet that catches what little light the moon has left. 2 ivory-handled revolvers ride his hips. His name is George Smith Patton, Jr. He commands the 3rd United States Army. Tonight, at this dead engine, on this dead road, he is looking east toward a country he could enter tomorrow if his tanks had fuel. They do not. In his diary that night, he will write 2 words that carry the whole story. Logistics rot. He does not know it yet, but less than 3 months from now, on a Friday morning after Thanksgiving, in the courtyard of a 14th city chateau in a Breton village called Plumodon, a rope will drop, and a 21-year-old private first class from a quartermaster truck company, a young black soldier named James Hendricks, will die at the end of it. The rope will be lawful. It will be authorized. It will trace back, through court-martial paperwork and chain of command signatures, to a memo Patton himself signed 3 weeks before he ever reached this dead Sherman on this dead road. This is the story of that memo. To understand how a general who wanted fuel ended up sending a farm boy to the gallows, you have to understand who was really running the war behind the war. His name was John Clifford Hodges Lee, 57 years old, Lieutenant General. Classified 1909 at West Point. Patton's own class. Lee commanded the communications zone, Keene. If you have never heard of it, that is because history remembers armies with names, 3rd Army, 1st Army, 9th Army, and forgets the machine that fed them, and forgets was the machine. It ran every port, every warehouse, every truck company, every hospital, every railhead behind the front lines and in the European theater. But today, 1 out of every 4 American soldiers in Europe wore Lee's patch, not Patton's, not Bradley's. Lee was an engineer, a martinet, a man of severe personal discipline. When he was promoted to Lieutenant General, 3-star general, he painted 3 stars on the front of his helmet and 3 more on the back, so no one behind him would ever get bit. His subordinates called him quietly, out of hearing, Jesus Christ himself Lee. From his initials, JCH. Omar Bradley, commander of 12th Army Group, wrote 1 word about the man in his memoirs: despised. But Lee had something Patton did not have. He had autonomy. He reported straight to Eisenhower. His inspector general was not Patton's inspector general. His provost marshal was not Patton's provost marshal. When Patton's tanks died at the Meuse, Patton could scream at Eisenhower. He could scream at Bradley. He could scream at the moon. He could not scream at Lee. Not effectively, because Lee did not answer to him. Remember that. It matters later. 6 days before Patton's Sherman died on the 25th of August, 1944. 2 things happened in France at the same hour. The first, the Curson troops entered Paris. 4 years of Nazi occupation ended in a single afternoon. Photographs were taken, flags were raised, women kissed strangers on the Champs-Élysées. It became one of the images of the war. The second, the Red Ball Express is becoming operations. You have probably heard the name. You may not know what it actually was. Red Ball was not a plan, it was a panic. 28 Allied divisions had raced east so fast that no rail line, no pipeline, no port could keep up. Cherbourg was the only functional harbor in Allied hands, and Cherbourg was 500 miles from the front. Someone had to move the fuels and the food and the ammunitions across that distance by truck, and someone had to do it now. Arma planners locked themselves in a room and did not come out for 38 hours. When they emerged, they had a system. 5,958 trucks, 23,000 drivers, of whom roughly 3 in 4 were African American, because the segregated Army of 1944 assigned black soldiers to service units by policy. A one-way loop out of Cherbourg to Chartres, 54 hours a round trip, blackout lights called cat eyes. On peak day, the 29th of August, nearly 6,000 vehicles moved more than 12,000 tons of supplies down that highway. Here is what you are not told about Red Ball. It burned 300,000 gallons of its own gasoline every day just to keep itself running. It cannibalized its own tires and transmissions faster than the Army could replace them. Drivers pulled the governors off their engines and ran at 60 miles per hour on roads never designed for it. Trucks tipped. Trucks broke. Trucks were abandoned by the roadside because there were no tow trucks left to save them. The men behind the wheels did not sleep. They ate rations while driving with one hand. This is not the story of an American miracle. This is the story of 23,000 young men, most of them barely out of their teens, holding a broken system together with their own bodies. Red Ball worked because they refused to let it fail, not because anyone had designed it to succeed, and it was leaking. Rewind 11 weeks, the 5th of June, 1944, the day before D-Day. Somewhere in England, Patton stands in front of the Third Army. Men who have not yet crossed the Channel, who have not yet seen combat, who do not know the general in front of them is not supposed to be here at all. He speaks without notes. He never uses his notes. He does not need them. He tells them the ordnance men are needed to supply the gun. He tells them the quartermaster is needed to bring up food and clothes, because in here his voice picks up, and men who were there remember it precisely, because where we are going there isn't a hell of a lot to steal. The line gets a laugh. It was meant to. 9 weeks later, that line becomes the darkest joke of the war, because his quartermasters, the Quartermaster Corps he had just honored, in Lee's communication zones on Lee's watch, running Lee's Red Ball trucks, become the largest theft ring the United States Army has ever produced. Not because Patton misjudged them, because the system Lee built was too big for any one man to see, too big for any one general to police, too big, in the end, even for Lee himself. And here, in August of 1944, the same month his Sherman would die at the Meuse, Patton sat down and signed a piece of paper, a memo, 2 paragraphs addressed to his commanders. Alice Kaplan reproduced it in her 2005 book, The Interpreter. You can read it in the American National Archives today. The memo begins, "I am gravely concerned with the increasing number of crimes of violence against French civilians which are being committed within the Army, particularly by service troops." Service troops. Read that phrase carefully. In 1944, service troops meant supply. Service troops meant transport. Service troops meant overwhelmingly black. The segregated Army had put roughly 8 out of every 10 African-American soldiers in service units. When Patton wrote service troops, whether consciously intended it or not, he was writing about them. He continued, rape would carry the death penalty. Company commanders would inform every soldier. This was not a suggestion. This was an order from the commander of the Third Army, and it went down the chain the way any order goes down the chain into every court-martial room in his Secretary of France. And here is the part military historians will spend the next 60 years trying to explain. What Patton did in that memo has a name. It is called command influence. A general, before any trial has begun, has told his subordinate courts what verdicts he expects. He has told them what punishments he wants. In 1944, under the Articles of War, this was legal. In 1950, under the new Uniform Code of Military Justice, it would be declared explicitly illegal. Explicitly. The example the drafters used, when they later explained why the law needed changing, sounded very much like Patton's August 1944 memo. Patton did not sign that memo to cause injustice. He signed it because French civilians were being raped and killed by American soldiers. That was true. That was documented. He wanted it stopped. But this is the part that matters. The memo did stop something. It did not stop the crimes. It stopped the presumption of a fair trial for a certain kind of defendant, a young black private in a quartermaster company, accused of violence against a French civilian, tried by an all-white court-martial that had just been told, in writing, by the commanding general of the theater, what the sentence was supposed to be. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States Army would execute 70 of its own soldiers in Europe. The overwhelming majority were black. Almost every one of them was hanged for the crimes named in that memo. The full number is coming. But hold that word, overwhelming, in your mind for now. It is the shape of what the memo did. 2 clocks are now running. Clock 1 started ticking in August of 1944, the moment Patton's pen came off the paper. It will run just under 4 months. It will stop in the courtyard of a 14th century chateau on a Friday morning after Thanksgiving. Clock 2 started ticking on the 25th of the same month, the moment the first Red Ball convoy rolled out of Cherbourg. And the moment in Paris, the black market woke up hungry after 4 years of German occupation. It will run for years. It will outlast Patton himself. One clock was a legal machine designed to protect French civilians. The other was a river of gasoline, cigarettes, and canned meat, quietly leaving American depots and disappearing into the alleys behind the Rue de Rivoli. Both were set in motion by the same man in the same month, in the same theater of war. Neither could be stopped now, not by Patton, not by Lee, not by Eisenhower. Before we reach that chateau, before the rope drops, we have to understand the size of what was leaking. We have to see the black market as it was. Not a rumor, not a scandal, an economy. An economy that was already by the autumn of 1944 larger than the treasury of liberated France. That is where we go next. Paris, September 1944. The cafes on the Rue de Rivoli are open again. The awnings have been dusted off. The waiters have shaved. The tourists, American tourists in olive drab with rifles slung on their backs, have started coming in. They order coffee, real coffee, the kind that has not been available in this city at any price since the summer of 1940. They pay in cigarettes. One lucky strike on the table besides the saucer buys the coffee. 2 lucky strikes buy a glass of wine. A carton, a full quarter of cigarettes buys a night in a hotel with a girl who was 4 months ago sleeping with a German colonel to feed her mother. The economy of Paris in September 1944 is not measured in francs. Francs are wallpaper. It is measured in American brands. A 5-gallon jerrycan of American gasoline in the alley behind that cafe will sell that same afternoon for $100, $1,944. That is roughly just for a French factory worker. It is more than an American private makes in a month. And there is not one jerry can for sale in that alley. There are dozens. There are pallets, hidden under tarps in courtyards, moved at night by men who 3 weeks ago were selling silk stockings to Wehrmacht officers, and who are now selling gasoline to whoever can pay. The Germans left Paris on the 25th of August. The black market did not leave with them. It changed suppliers. That is all. Now do the arithmetic. Third Army, under Patton. First Army, under Quartermasters. Combined daily fuel consumption at the front, 800,000 gallons. That is the demand. The supply, everything the Red Ball Express can push out of Cherbourg on any given day, minus the 300,000 gallons the Red Ball itself burns just to run its own trucks. Even before anyone steals a drop, the mathematics do not close. There is not enough. There was never enough. And now the mathematics have a second column, a column no one at Supreme Headquarters wants to put on paper. The column labeled leakage. How much fuel is disappearing between Cherbourg and Chartres? No one knows exactly. The numbers change depending on who is writing the report and what career they are trying to protect. Estimates from Criminal Investigation Division files, later collated, suggest that during the peak months of the crisis, roughly 300 gallons of United States Army gasoline vanished into the Paris black market every month. Every month. That is 100,000 jerry cans. That is Patton's tanks. That is the winter offensive. That is Berlin by Christmas. And it is gone. Cigarettes are worse. In one 30-day period late in 1944, according to one researcher, a researcher whose numbers have been challenged by scholarly reviewers, so treat this as an order of magnitude, not gospel. Of the 11 million packs of American cigarettes shipped to the European theater in that month, 9.5 million were stolen and sold before they ever reached a soldier's hand. 9.5 million out of 11. Even if that figure is off by half, even if it is off by 2/3, you are looking at a rate of theft that has no equivalent in the modern history of the United States Army. And no one is holding the men at the top of it accountable, because there is no one man at the top of it. That is the terrible truth. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a mafia. It is a leak in every joint of a pipe that runs from Cherbourg to the front, Every joint, every seal, every valve, a supply sergeant in a warehouse who signs off on a truck that never actually leaves the yard, a convoy commander who reports an ambush that never happened, to explain missing pallets, a dock worker in Le Havre who forgets one crate in 50. Multiply that by 10,000 men in the communications zone. This is what the numbers actually look like. Side-E investigators working in the shadow of the front will eventually document something worse than random theft. They will document rings, mixed rings. American quartermasters sergeants working with Corsican gangsters out of Marseille. The same Corsicans who ran cigarettes and prostitutes for the Germans a year before, and are perfectly happy to run them for the Americans now. Some of the buyers on the French end are former collaborators, men who kept lists of resistance members for the Gestapo and are now scrubbed their pasts by getting rich on American lucky strikes. The men who fought the Nazis are trading with the men who worked for them. That is the moral geometry of Paris in September of 1944. And the pipeline that supplies them both is the same pipeline that is supposed to feed the boys freezing at the front. Now come back to the road. Come back to the red ball, because this is not the story of Detroit boardrooms or European crime syndicates. This is the story of the 20-year-old kid behind the wheel. He has a name and a face. His name on this particular afternoon of the 5th of September 1944 is Corporal Charles H. Johnson. He belongs to the 783rd Military Police Battalion. There is a photograph of him in the National Archives. You can find it online, waving a red ball convoy through a crossroads near Alençon in Normandy. He is young. He is black. He is directing traffic in a war he was not by law à la Tafade combat unit. Corporal Johnson is not a thief. But Corporal Johnson has not eaten a hot meal in 3 days because the ration convoy that was supposed to reach his MP unit was diverted somewhere south of Chartres. Diverted to what? He does not know. He suspects. Every MP by now suspects. A Red Ball veteran interviewed decades later by the Army Quartermaster Museum described the moment plainly. His convoy passed an MP checkpoint. The MPs looked hungry. They looked like men who had been on their feet for 4 days. The driver kicked a case of C rations off the back of the truck as he rolled past. Not stolen, given. To an American soldier who was starving because someone further up the pipe stole his. Is that a crime? Under Army regulations, technically yes. Under any recognizable morality, of course not. But this is where the story of the Red Ball becomes impossible to tell cleanly. Because the same drivers who kicked rations off the back to feed hungry MPs also, some of them, pulled off the highway at night and sold a jerrycan or two to a Frenchman who paid in cash. And a few of them, a small few, pulled off the highway and did not come back at all, because they had joined the 20,000 American soldiers who were AWOL in France that autumn. ACOL soldiers needed money. The black market paid. None of these men are monsters. Some are heroes, some are criminals. Most are 20 years old, 500 miles from anyone who loves them in a system that has failed them from above. This is what General Lee's empire actually looked like at street level. Now look at it from the top. John Clifford Hodges Lee, at his headquarters, ran a shadow bureaucracy that mirrored Eisenhower's SHAF. 2 adjutant generals, 2 inspector generals, 2 provost marshals. Eisenhower's memoir would use one word for the result. Confusion. Confusion between the 2 organizations. Jurisdictional overlap. Careers protected by paperwork nobody had time to read. Lee was not stealing. Let that be clear. There is no evidence, none that John C. Lee ever pocketed $1 of Army property. He went to church twice on Sundays. He recited scripture at dinner. He was, by every account, his personal character, an honest man. But he had built an empire too large for one honest man to police. And the Army had given him no one above him, except Eisenhower, 400 miles away, planning the invasion of Germany, with the authority or the time to police him. That is, the structural corruption. Not a person. A vacuum. And Patton, at the Mews, on the 31st of August, with his Sherman dying beneath his boots, understood it perfectly. His diary that autumn is full of it. Rage at the rot, rage at the loss, rage at the men in Paris eating steak while his tankers ran dry. But rage was all he had. He could not touch Lee. He had no authority to open the books of the communications zone. When he asked, he was politely told, sometimes not so politely, to mind his own theater. Lee reported Ike. Only Ike could investigate Lee, and Ike at that moment had a war to run. So the fuel kept leaking, and Patton's tanks kept dying. And Patton signed his memo, the memo about crimes against French civilians, because that was one thing, one single thing, that he could still control. He could hang the rapists. He could not hang the thieves. Remember that sentence. It is the entire moral shape of what happens next. Because Clock 1 is now running fast. The village of Le Percoul, up the hill from Ploumodon in Brittany, is liberated in the last days of August 1944.
The Germans left in a hurry. The Americans arrive.
Among them, the men of the 326th Quartermaster Truck Company. All black, all service troops. Their job is transport, the supplies for the campaign to take Brest 60 miles to the west. Among these men is a 21-year-old private first class from the American South, James E. Hendricks. Round cheeks, gentle eyes. According to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Donald Tucker, a well-behaved young soldier with no disciplinary history. Some nights after the liberation, Hendricks is drunk, very drunk. He has been drinking with local French wine, which is stronger than he is used to, and he is far from anyone he knows. He wanders. He knocks on a farmhouse door in the middle of the night. He is looking for something. The historical record is not entirely clear what a woman or shelter or simply company. He shouts in broken French. Ouvrez, mademoiselle. Open, miss. The door does not open. He fires his rifle through it. On the other side of that door, Victor Bignon, a French civilian, is killed instantly. His wife, Noémie Bignon, will see her husband die on the floor of her own kitchen. Hendricks is arrested. He does not resist. He does not in any account deny what happened. He is drunk, he is scared, he is 21 years old. His court-martial takes place in Brittany under 8th Corps, which at that moment sits under Patton's Third Army. In a room that also happens to be, this is important, one of the standard court's martial rooms handling multiple cases of American soldiers accused of crimes against French civilians in that region. The interpreter for the trial is a Frenchman, 45 years old, a novelist from Saint-Brieuc. His name is Louis Guillou. Before the war, he wrote fictions of some reputation. During the German occupation, he barely ate. When the Americans asked for a bilingual local to translate testimony, someone pointed to him. He speaks English beautifully, though he has been to England only once as a boy. Guillou watches the trial. He translates Noémie Bignon's testimony into English. He translates the American prosecutor's questions into French. He translates Hendricks's own words, halting, drunk, remembering, terrified, into a language the court can enter into the record. And he watches the verdict, guilty, death by hanging. Now, at the same time, a few miles away in the town of Les Nevins, another American shoots another Frenchman in another drunken argument. His name is Captain George P. Whittington. He is white. He is officer. The shooting happens in an open courtyard, not through a closed door. It is, by any legal standard, closer to murder than what Hendricks did. There are witnesses, there is a body. Whittington is court-martialed by 8th Corps, in the same room, with some of the same officers on the panel. He is acquitted. Louis Guillou is in that room too. He translates that trial as well. And after it is over, he goes back to his lodgings in Brittany, and he writes in his private diary that he cannot understand what he has just seen. He cannot reconcile it to a man, 2 shootings, 2 drunks, 2 French dead, 1 rope, 1 handshake. He will carry that memory for the rest of his life. In 1976, more than 30 years later, he will publish a novel called OK, Joe. It fictionalizes what he saw. He gives the characters different names, but the shapes of the story is unmistakable. It is the shape of the 2 trials, and it is the shape of American justice in liberated France. Nobody read it. Not in America. Not in English. Not for another 29 years. Then, in 2005, an American scholar named Alice Kaplan, a professor of French whose father had been a prosecutor at Nuremberg, pulled Guillou's diary and his novel and, most importantly, the actual court-martial transcripts out of the National Archives. And she wrote a book called The Interpreter. And in that book, she laid out the numbers. Here they are. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States Army executed 70 its own soldiers in the European theater, almost all by hanging. 55 of those 70 men were African American. 55 out of 70 is 79%. African American soldiers in that army at that time made up 8.5% of the force. Do the ratio in your head. A black soldier accused of a capital crime in the European theater was statistically executed at a rate roughly 9 times higher than his share of the force. The overwhelming majority of the 55 men hanged were convicted of rape or of murder against French civilians. In other words, exactly the crimes that Patton's August 44 memo had told his commanders required the death penalty. The memo had done what memos do. It went down the chain. It reached the courts. The courts read it. The courts obeyed it, and the ropes came out. You cannot draw a line in law that connects Pat's pen to Hendrix's neck. Patton did not sit on that court-martial. Patton did not sign Hendrix's execution order. That would come from a different chain. But you can draw a line in evidence. You can draw a line in cause and effect. The memo went out in August. The court-martial machinery it activated, in a segregated army with almost entirely white judge advocates, did what a segregated army would do under a general order that had, in effect, pre-announced the sentence. It hanged black boys. It let white officers walk. Not because every officer in the JAG Corps was a racist, not because every court was corrupt, but because the system had been told, in writing from the top, what the correct answer was, for a certain kind of crime that was, in that army, disproportionately going to be charged against a certain color of defendant. That is command influence. That is what the 1950 Uniform Code of Military Justice would eventually make illegal. 6 years after Hendrix was hanged. Now hold both clocks in your mind at once. Clock 1, August 1944, Patton's memo. November 1944, Hendrix in a rope, a line you can draw with your finger from a signature at 3rd Army Headquarters to a courtyard in Plumadania. Clock 2, August 1944, the red ball begins. September 1944, the Paris black market begins to eat the pipeline alive. Autumn 1944, 300,000 gallons of gasoline a month disappearing, and no rope, no hanging, no death sentence, ever. For a single officer at a supply depot, there are courts-martial for supply theft, hundreds of them. Some officers get 5 years, some get 10. A handful of enlisted men get more. But of all the men the American Army hangs in Europe in those years, none, not one, is hanged for what everyone knows is the greatest theft ring in Army history. The rope is reserved for the boys who shot Frenchmen while drunk. Now, at the end of Cloctas' first act, comes the 16th of December, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium and Luxembourg. The German army, the army that everyone at Supreme Headquarters had assured themselves was finished, launches its last great offensive of the war, what we called the Battle of the Bulge. The 28th Infantry Division holds a section of front called the Skyline Drive. Within hours, they are overrun. Within days, thousands of American infantrymen are cut off in freezing forest, in temperatures that will drop to below 0 Fahrenheit. K rations run out. Medics run out of morphine. Ambulances cannot get through. Men die in foxholes with their eyes open, frozen to their rifles. At the same hour, 600 miles to the west, in the alleys behind the Rue de Rivoli, an American Lucky Strikes selling for the price of a French factory worker's weekly wage. A carton of them is selling for a small fortune. And somewhere in a warehouse behind the Norman coast, we cannot name the exact warehouse. We cannot name the exact truck. But the SIL files leave no doubt that scenes like this were happening. Supplies that should have been rolling east were being unloaded into private hands. You cannot connect any single death in the bulge to any single stolen jerry can. That is a bridge no historian is allowed to build. But you can put both facts on the table beside each other. Both are true. Both happens in the same week. Both happened in the same army. Both happened under 2 generals who despised each other and could not touch each other, one of whom had already signed the memo that would hang the wrong men. By the end of December 1944, this is what the war looks like from a certain angle. In Brittany, they are still hanging men. In Paris, they are still selling cigarettes. In Ardennes, they are still dying. And in his diary at his headquarters, George Patton is writing about relieving Bastogne, a feat that will become deservedly one of the great American military achievements of the war, while his supply lines rot behind him and his memo continues to send black boys to French gallows. Both are Patton. Both are the same year, the same theater, the same signature. He does not draw the connection in his diary. He may never have drawn it in his life. He would die too soon to sit in the and think through. Louis Guillou drew it in a diary in Saint-Brieuc, in a language nobody in America would read for 60 years. That is the terrible symmetry at the middle of this story. The general who had the most power to see what was happening did not want to see it. The interpreter, who had no power at all, could not stop seeing it. And in between them, in the courtyard of the Chateau La Vallée at Ploubadin, on a rainy Friday morning after Thanksgiving 1944, a young black private from a Quartermasters truck company was climbing steps toward a rope. His unit, the 333 to C6th, had by then moved on to Belgium, to Holland, to the front. Alice Kaplan's research would later show that the 3,326th Quartermaster Truck Company had, and this is the exact language of the historical record, played a key role in transporting the supplies crucial for winning the Brest campaign. Hendrix's own company had helped win a piece of the war. He was not there to see it. He was hanging in a stone courtyard in Brittany while his brothers in arms rolled trucks toward the German border. By the end of 1944, then, the war behind the war has two faces. One face is the black private in the rope, killed for a single drunken shooting, sentenced by a court that had been pre-instructed from the top what to do. The other face is the white officer at a communications zone warehouse, still on the job, still signing manifests, sitting on a Swiss banquet. Nobody in Patton's headquarters had the authority to open. Every general at the top of the American war knew what was happening. None of them could break the arrangement, because the arrangement had been built into the army itself, at the level of who reported to whom, at the level of who could be punished and who could not, at the level of what a general order could do and what it could not touch. Patton will die soon, sooner than anyone expects, before the biggest black market trials even reach a verdict, and the machine he helped build, the memo, the courts, the rope, will outlive him by more than 3 years. It will hang its last black market convict, a soldier named Manuel Martins, in 1947. 2 years after the war has ended, 2 years after Patton is in his grave at Ham, we are about to walk into the aftermath, into the survivor, into the ledger of who paid and who did not, because the last part of this story is not the crime. It is the peace, and the peace was more unjust than the war. Spring 1945. The war in Europe is ending. Everyone can feel it now. The Rhine has been crossed, Cologne has fallen. The Ruhr pocket is closing around 300,000 German soldiers who will surrender in a few weeks. In American newspapers, the maps have arrows that point in only one direction, east, into the heart of a Reich that is dying by the hour. And in 100 requisitioned buildings across France and Belgium, former town halls, former schools, former courthouses that 6 months ago were flying swastikas. American courts-martial are grinding through their dockets, not the murder cases. Those, most of them, are already finished. The ropes have dropped. The men in the grave. These are the theft cases. Hundreds of them, officers and enlisted men, sergeants and privates, quartermasters and dock workers and truck drivers and clerks, all charged with variations of the same thing. Diversion of government property, fraudulent requisition, conspiracy, larceny of military supplies in time of war. We do not know the exact number. Nobody does. The Judge Advocate General's records survive, but they were never fully collated. Kenneth Alford, an American researcher who spent decades in those files, claimed in a 2015 book that these cases DC became, his words, the largest general court-martial in all of military history. A tobacco theft ring run out of Paris involving dozens of American servicemen. His numbers have been challenged. A reviewer at George Mason University, writing in a scholarly journal 3 years after the book came out, pointed out that Alford's sourcing is inconsistent and that some of his figures don't survive contact with the archival record. So we cannot lean on Alford's specific counts. But this much is stable. Hundreds of American soldiers tried for supply theft in Europe in 1945. Most received prison sentences. A few years, sometimes more, dishonorable discharges, forfeiture of pay, almost none were hanged. Now, recall the number from earlier, the 55. 55 black soldiers hanged for violence against French civilians. 0 white supply officers hanged for stealing the fuel that killed American soldiers in the Bulge. That is the ledger. That is the peace. There is one exception, one name that has to be spoken, because he is the punctuation mark at the end of this story. Manuel Martins. The war has been over for 2 years. It is 1947. The occupation of Germany has settled into its rhythms. American soldiers are still there, running black markets that never quite closed after VE Day. Cigarettes, coffee, chocolate, watches. In Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Munich, the currency is not Reichsmarks anymore. It is not Deutsche Marks yet. It is lucky strikes. Still, according to Kenneth Alford's research, Manuel Martinez is caught, convicted, and hanged for armed robbery committed in the course of a black market operation. The war is over. The Third Reich is finished. But an American Army rope in 1947 still comes out for the right kind of defendant. The black market itself will not fully die until 1948 or later, when the German economy stabilizes under currency reform and the buyers finally dry up. Not because any general defeated it, because the war ended and the port of Antwerp opened and the railroads were rebuilt and eventually the pipes stopped leaking because there was nothing valuable enough left to steal. That is how black market ended. Not with justice, with economics. Now opened the ledger of the survivors, John Clifford Hodges Lee. He is never investigated, not officially, not seriously. His name comes up in 100 CID files, always at the edge of the story, always as the man in whose zone Tizian that occurred, never as the target of the inquiry. Eisenhower moves him to command American forces in Italy in 1945. He serves there through 1947. He retires with a lieutenant general's pension and a spotless personnel file. Then he does something no one who worked under him would have predicted. He devotes the last 11 years of his life to a Christian lay organization, the Brotherhood of St. Andrew, an Episcopal men's ministry. He leads it. He writes for it. He travels the country speaking at parish meetings. He preaches, in effect, a gospel of Christian discipline. The same discipline he demanded from his subordinates in the communications zone. Past dies in 1958. He is 71. The obituary calls him, the exact phrase, an administrator of the highest character. The empire he built and could not police is not mentioned. George Smith Patton, Jr., he does not live to see the aftermath at all. On the 9th of December 1945, in a staff car near Mannheim, in occupied Germany, Patton is riding to a pheasant hunted. His driver looks up. A truck is turning across their lane. There is not time to stop. The impact throws Patton forward. His head strikes the metal partition between the front and rear seats. His spinal cord is crushed at the third and fourth vertebrae of his neck. He is conscious. He is paralyzed from the neck down. They take him to a military hospital in Heidelberg. He lives 12 more days. He tries briefly to be Patton about it. He jokes with the nurses. He asks about his dog Willie, the bull terrier, who had followed him across France and Germany. On the 21st of December, 1945, at 10 minutes to 6 in the evening, his heart stops in his sleep. He is buried at the American cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg, the cemetery of the men of the Third Army who died in the Battle of the Bulge. He had said more than once during the war that he wished to be buried with his men. His grave stands at the head of the ranks. The stones behind him, all the way to the tree line, are the men his memo could not protect and could not have hanged if he had wanted to. His last diary entry from the autumn before the accident contains one sentence that every biographer eventually quotes. "Another war has ended, and with it my usefulness to the world." He never wrote about Hendricks, not once, not that we know of. The court-martial machinery he had set in motion in August of 1944 kept turning for 2 more years after he was in the ground. Louis Guillou, he goes home, to St. Brieuc in Brittany, the town on the coast where he was born. He writes. He publishes. He is respected in French literary circles, but never truly famous. He carries the memory of those trials, of Hendricks and Whittington in the same room, of the 2 verdicts, and it becomes slowly the wound around which his final years of work are organized. In 1976, 3 decades after the war, he publishes a novel called OK, Joe. It is at last the story of what he saw, fictionalized, names changed, but recognizable to anyone who knew the courtrooms. It sells modestly in French in France. It is not translated into English for another 29 years. He dies in 1980, quietly in the town where he was born. He did not live to see his book be believed. Alice Kaplan, an American academic, a professor of French, the daughter of an American lawyer who had prosecuted Nazis at Nuremberg, a man raised, in other words, in the belief that the United States was the country that tried the crimes of others, not the country that hanged its own boys by ratio of skin color. Kaplan finds Guillou's novel. She reads it in French. She goes to the National Archives in Maryland. She pulls the court-martial transcripts. She pulls the JAG statistics. She lays the numbers next to Guillou's narrative, and she confirms, with archival paperwork, every terrible thing his novel had implied. She publishes The Interpreter in 2005, 61 years after Hendricks died. The family of James Hendricks. They were never told properly what happened to him. Not the whole truth. For decades, the Army's letterhome said what those letters always said, that their son had been convicted of a crime, that the sentence had been carried out. It did not say where he was buried. It did not tell them the story of the courtroom. It did not mention the memo. Kaplan tracks them down in the American South. She sits in living rooms with cousins and nephews and shows them transcripts. She tells them where he lies. Somewhere near Plumaudan, in an unmarked plot in a repatriation cemetery, along with the other men the American Army hanged and did not want back. The family, when asked, says one thing: they would like his remains brought home. The remains have not been brought home. Captain George P. Whittington, the white officer who shot a Frenchman in an open courtyard in Lesneven and walked out of the same room in which Hendricks was condemned to die. He returns to civilian life. Details fade from the record. Kaplan devoted an entire chapter of her book to searching for him, and the chapter is titled, "With a Precision That Lands Like a Slap, Whittington's Peace." He got his peace. There is one final turn to this story, a twist that vindicates nothing and no one, but that has to be spoken because it is true. The mechanism Patton used in his August 1944 memo, command influence, a commanding officer instructing his courts what verdicts to hand down, was made explicitly illegal by the Uniform Code of Military Justice in 1950. 6 years after the memo, 5 years after Patton's death, the example the drafters used in explaining why the law needed to exist was not named as Patton, but it did not need to be. Anyone who had served in the European theater knew, and more than that, the extraordinary combat performance of black soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge, the Red Ball Press, and other service units who volunteered to fill the emergency infantry gap and who fought with a courage that even Southern white officers were forced to acknowledge, became part of the political weight behind Harry Truman's executive order in 1948 that ended racial segregation in the American armed forces. The machine Patton had helped build, the memo, the courts, the ropes, helped indirectly create the pressure that dismantled the machine itself. He did not live to see it. He would not have understood it, probably. But it happened. Close the ledger now. And look at the names at the bottom of the page. James Hendricks, Private First Class, 3326th Quartermaster Truck Company, 21 years old, somewhere near Plumaudan. 54 other African-American soldiers executed by their own army in Europe, buried in unmarked plots in a segregated hillsides somewhere in France. Noémie Bignon, widow of Victor Bignon of Le Percoul. She testified. She went home. She does not appear again in the historical record. 23,000 Red Bull drivers, most of them black, most of them younger than the century. A handful became sergeants. Almost none of them have names in the official histories. Louis Guillou, interpreter, novelist, the only witness who wrote it down while he could still remember every face. Look at those names, and look at the names above them. The generals, the businessmen, the bureaucrats, Patton dead in Luxembourg at 60. Lee in an Episcopal cemetery, honored at Etienne. Whittington in his peace. The man who saw the injustice most clearly was written out of history for 60 years. The man who wrote the memo that hanged the wrong men is buried with full military honors at the head of the Bulge, dead. The man who ran the empire whose leakage killed some of those Bulge dead, retired with a pension, took up religion and led a Christian brotherhood into the Eisenhower years. Between the black private hanged for shooting a farmer while drunk and the white captain acquitted for shooting a farmer while drunk, is one memo, one signature, one courtroom. None of it was ever explained. Not by Patton, not by Lee, not by the Army. The black market itself was not brought down by any general. It was brought down by the port of Antwerp opening in November of 1944, by the French railways being repaired, by portable pipelines finally reaching the front, and after the war, by the collapse of the buyers when the French economy came back to life. It faded because it ran out of customers, not because justice caught it. Justice was busy elsewhere. Justice was hanging the men who were easiest to hang. That is the story. Patton wanted the death penalty for the men who stole from soldiers. The courts he built hanged a 21-year-old black private for shooting a farmer through a door while drunk, and let a white captain walk out for shooting a farmer in a courtyard while drunk. and left the men who bled the supply pipeline lane dry to go home, mostly with prison sentences short enough to serve out and pensions large enough to retire on. The record is not that no one paid. The record is that the wrong people paid, and that the war produced an administration who took 60 years to be documented in a language Americans would read. Somewhere near Plumadon, in the Breton earth, the bones of James Hendricks are still waiting. His family is still waiting for him to come home.